Hi Year 12. What we're going to do with this video today is talk a bit about your Section B essay writing. Now I thought it'd be useful to do a video so you can re-watch this if you need to, or pause and wind it back at various points to just double check things. You recently answered this question and you've now been given feedback and a mark out of 25. Now the first thing to say is Section B essay questions require you to be thematic. And you know there are 3 themes that exist in our Native Americans course. So you can write about the political and legal rights that Native Americans had or didn't have in this time period. And you can see there what we mean by that. We can also talk about their socio-cultural rights, by which we mean the way Native Americans are able to live and express their cultural heritage. Or we could talk about their economic and land rights. Now these things can overlap. And it's also true that some turning points or agents of change, whether that be presidents or Congress or the Supreme Court, will affect these different themes in different ways at different times. And so your job is to be able to recognize that and therefore give a nuanced answer as to how the civil rights of Native Americans have been affected. Now, in this particular question, your focus was on a turning point, the Dawes Act. And the question says, how far do you agree with the statement? So your first job was to write an introduction, and your introduction would likely summarize the Dawes Act, acknowledge that there are other turning points, and you might even name them, but crucially, your introduction has to set out your argument. How far do you agree with this statement? You must state explicitly how far you agree. I would encourage you to therefore use phrases like to a great extent or to a small extent. Saying just to an extent does not give the person marking the exam a clear idea as to how far you agree. So those words great and small before the word extent are really important. It's also true to say that if you use the phrase it can be argued, well, anything can be argued. So it's perhaps better to be even more explicit in your language by saying, in this essay, I will argue, or it will be argued that, so that you're far clearer in actually what you're trying to say. Once you've done that, you know that there are main sections that need to be included, and you're likely to have 3 based on each of our turning points. And you must show synthesis. And the mark scheme says you must have fully developed synthesis to get a level 6 response, the top level. That will get you 21 to 25 marks out of 25, an A star. Synthesis means to compare, to bring things together. So you're going to have to mention at least 2 turning points because you need at least 2 things to bring together. You could do more than that, but you don't have to. And then you should have a mini conclusion at the end of each section where you make a decision. Which turning point that you've just discussed has affected that aspect of Native American civil rights the most? And you need to give a reason why. That leaves your conclusion where you're going to reiterate your answer, acknowledge some of the counterpoints, but then justify why your answer is correct. If you need to, take a moment to pause the video now, have a look at your essay, and just double check that you followed this structure. Now, let's deconstruct the question slightly. The first thing about this question that jumps out to me is that it gives you a primary focus for your essay. It gives you an opinion here. It says the Dawes Act of 1887. So this is the primary focus of the essay. Now, it doesn't have to, therefore, appear in every section. It doesn't have to appear every time you mention one of those themes, but it's likely that it's going to. Certainly, it's going to appear probably in 2 of the 3, I would suggest. The question then says this. It says, well, was the Dawes Act the most significant turning point? This implies that you need to have considered what makes a turning point significant. You need to establish some criteria. How are you going to judge whether a turning point is more significant than another? How will you make that decision? It also says that this is a most significant turning point in the history of Native American civil rights. Now, that does not mean that it necessarily had a positive effect. It just says it's the most significant. So it could mean that the Dawes Act established and respected their rights, but we know that's not true. So in this case, it means that the Dawes Act was significant and the most significant turning point because Native American rights were ignored and they were oppressed. So it doesn't necessarily mean that their rights are enforced by the Dawes Act. It just says it's significant. It's not a question of whether it's positive or negative. It's a measure of importance. We've already established that you have to talk about how far you agree with the statement. So there must be a decision and you have to justify this. And then lastly, it gives you a time period. Now, this is slightly shortened because you haven't finished the course yet. In your actual exam, it will go from 1865 to 1992, and you must write about the entire time period. What they are looking for you to do is select a range of turning points, therefore. So don't just mention things in the 1900s here. Your essay will lack breadth. You need to mention things from 1865 to 1934, broadly speaking. Have a look at your essay again and have a think about, did I do any of these well? Are there some that I missed? Is there something about the question that I maybe misunderstood? If you need to, pause the video at this point. Now, we've mentioned 2 things here, and these 2 things stuck out to me when looking at your essays. We need to demonstrate synthesis, so we need to compare things, and that needs to be fully developed. And we need to construct an argument, which implies we know how to judge whether something is important or more important than something else. What I'd like you to do is pause the video at this point again and just quickly spider diagram some of these ideas. You might want to take 5 to 8 minutes. How many words or phrases can you come up with that you could use in your writing that show you're comparing 2 things? And then secondly, what criteria might you use to judge whether one thing, in this case a turning point, is more important than another? Pause the video now and spend 5 to 8 minutes doing that. Okay, here's my ideas, everybody. Starting on the left, here's about 10 to 12 phrases that I might use in my writing. And I may well actually try and memorize some of these so that when it comes to the exam eventually, I've just got a bank of words or phrases that I can keep putting into my essay. So I might say similarly, or comparatively, or compared with, or conversely, or more than, or nevertheless, or regardless. All of these phrases are allowing me and demonstrating to the examiner that I am showing synthesis. How about the other side? Here's what I came up with. You might decide a turning point is more important because the changes it introduces last for a longer period of time. It results in long-term change. That would be a way to judge if one turning point is more important than another. Another way could be to think about how many people did it affect. Was it widespread? Did it focus on just one particular type of Native American? Was it extensive? A third one could be this. Well, how different were the changes from what had occurred before? Is this turning point just an extension of something that has already been started? Or is it radically different and therefore displays a completely different direction that in this case the federal government is taking? How about this? How deep were the changes? What I mean by that is, did it really affect, in this case, Native American lives significantly? Was it a significant change for them? Or was it kind of surface level change? So how deep were the changes? That could be a criteria. We could talk about how memorable the turning point was. Is it still affecting people today? Is it still looked upon as a significant turning point retrospectively? That's trickier in this course because we don't go into the kind of historiography, what other historians think of turning points. But it is a valid criteria we could use. And then lastly, did it mark a change of attitude? Or did it lead to a change in attitude towards Native Americans in this case? So when constructing an argument, I might consider these criteria as a justification for why one turning point is more important than another. Now, for the last two slides, I want to show you how you might write to show synthesis and to show that you're judging importance to a high standard. If I was writing a paragraph from one of the sections of my essay, then I could put a first sentence that looks like this. In relation to Native American social cultural rights, the Dawes Act was more significant than reservation policy. That's a pretty good sentence starter for a section. I then could go into everything that the Dawes Act did to impact social cultural rights. So for instance, I talk about private ownership. I talk about how that breaks communal bonds. I talk about how it changes Indians' culture markedly. I talk about how it affected Native American women. I'm displaying good knowledge here. And then I could talk about reservation policy. And again, I could go through the impacts that reservation policy had on social cultural Native American rights. Now, this is good, but it is limited. Because although I name a theme, and although I make a decision, I'm lacking something quite important. There is no argument here. I am not giving a reason why the Dawes Act was more significant than reservation policy. I'm stating an answer, but it is unsubstantiated. When I then go on to talk about the Dawes Act, I'm showing good knowledge. And I'm also being analytical. I'm not just regurgitating facts. I'm using that knowledge to describe and explain the impact it had on Native Americans. So if I was to write in this way, I would be scoring some marks. However, the weakness is that, again, no argument is made. So I state in this second section, this was more important than reservation policy. But I am not giving a reason why, and therefore my argument is lacking. In addition to that, I'm not actually comparing here. It looks like I am, because in the first sentence I make a comparison, but then in the main section of my paragraph, no comparison is made. I deal with the two turning points, Dawes Act and reservation policy, in isolation. I talk about Dawes and then I talk about reservations. So there is no synthesis here whatsoever. It's good knowledge, it's well analysed, but there is no synthesis. I am never directly comparing these two. To put it another way, the words Dawes Act and reservation policy never appear in the same sentence after the first one. Now, let's show you a better way of doing this. Here, I've got an opening sentence, but I've given more. Because I've named a clear theme and I've given a decision, just like the previous example, but now I've given a justification. So I say this, in relation to Native American social cultural rights, the Dawes Act was more significant than reservation policy. That's the same as the previous one, but I say this, as it resulted in more permanent long-term changes to natives' way of life. So there's my theme, there's my decision, but now this is more of a level 6 standard because there is my justification. I think it produces longer term changes. So therefore, I am now synthesizing as well as justifying. I'm making an argument. And then what I would do is I go on to try and justify this in more detail. I want to elaborate on long-term change. So I'm not just going to talk about Dawes and then talk about reservations. I'm going to interchange between the two. So here, I give some knowledge. Reservation policy did attend to ban or change the social cultural rights of Native Americans. So I talk about the role of the tribal chief, the laws, the ending of polygamy. But then what I do is I weaken that argument by saying, well, however, Native American culture continued. So I'm starting to chip away at reservation policy because my decision is that the Dawes Act is more significant. But then I use one of my kind of comparing phrases. So here I'm now showing synthesis because I don't just keep going on about reservations. I stop myself and say, in contrast, the Dawes Act weakened these tribal ties by allotting lands to individual families. So I'm saying reservations didn't go far enough, and now I'm popping in, but the Dawes Act did. So I've synthesized in the first sentence, and now I've synthesized again. And then I go on to explain that. So I give reasoning for why I'm saying the Dawes Act weakened tribal ties, and this is going to support my argument the Dawes Act was more significant. I then keep that reasoning going, but do you notice I link it back to my argument and therefore display synthesis, because I say the belief in shared ownership was the foundation of other native beliefs, such as being nomadic, and therefore was more important than reservation policy. I've got an argument that I am trying to justify. I'm being disciplined here. I'm not writing everything down that I know about the Dawes Act and reservation policy. I'm being self-controlled. I'm only mentioning what supports my argument. And I've synthesized 3 times already. But I carry on, because then I make a second point, that Indian women also suffered. That's true. I said that in the first example, but I wasn't using it to construct an argument. And what I do here now is I bring in another turning point, the Wheeler-Howard Act. And I mention how that tries to correct the impact the Dawes Act had on women, but it's ultimately unsuccessful because it doesn't have long-term change. So I think here, this is a level 6 standard, because I've got my decision, but now with a justification, and there are 4 examples of synthesis just in this one section. Ironically, there's almost less knowledge in a way, it seems, but actually this is far more sophisticated, because the knowledge is there, but it's used to construct an argument. And it does that by comparing the turning points explicitly, comparing them frequently, and it does it by giving a justification for the answer. If I was to move on from here, I'd add further sentences to elaborate on this, and then I'd give a mini conclusion. The Dawes Act was more significant because it had long-term changes or effects in terms of social, cultural, Native American rights.